Welcome to this. This is the first in a series of videos that I'm going to do on a streetcar named Desire. So this one's going to focus just on scene one, and I'm going to go through each scene. Now, of course, there's so much I could say about each scene, and every word has a kind of weight to it when Williams is concerned. So this isn't an exhaustive analysis by any stretch of the imagination, but I will try and touch on some of the central themes and ideas in each scene. And in this scene and in this video, I'm going to focus on the way that Williams introduces the setting, some of the characters, and a few of the central themes in the play. Because, of course, he's already giving us a sense of the ideas and questions that he wants to raise through the drama. So we're going to focus on four things, all of which start with P: place, property, people, and power. And as we look at those four things, hopefully we'll have a little bit of a glimpse into what Williams is up to in this first scene. So first, place. Of course, the play is set in New Orleans, specifically in the French Quarter, so the old part of town. And I want us to see that it's a city of cultural intermingling in terms of its history, also in terms of sex and the liberation that comes along with that, and also race. So first, a little bit on the history of the French Quarter, or the Vieux Carré, it's got kind of had a colonial influence over time. So the French colonised it in 1718, and then it's sort of gone in and out of French control over the next 50, 60 years. So briefly, for about 40 years, went into Spanish control, and then back into French control in 1803 before the Louisiana Purchase and the US attaining control of the area in 1803. So it's a place that's undergone a lot of change architecturally, but also in terms of its people. And we see that reflected, I think, in the stage directions at the beginning of the play, where it's described as the building is described as weathered grey with rickety outside stairs and galleries and quaintly ornamented gables. And I think that noun phrase to describe the gables is possibly a hint at the kind of hangover of colonial architecture. So we've got the sort of remains of colonial influence in this part of the town. Now, of course, that's changed a lot in 100 years or so because of the Civil War sort of destroying the majority of the buildings, and so new ones have popped up here and there. But I think Williams is kind of giving us a hint at the history of this place, and how actually it's a combination of different cultures and countries and backgrounds, all kind of intermingling to create this place of what he calls spirit and life. Now, what about Williams and New Orleans? Well, when he arrived in the French Quarter, he noted many exciting possibilities, a little bit of a euphemistic phrase that could hint at the nightlife, but also the kind of artistic, musical and literary possibilities, and also maybe sexual, because it's a place of sexual liberation as well as cultural acceptance. So Williams spoke of the artistic and bohemian life, and how it is all very interesting, some utterly appalling. And even here in his memoirs, we get this sense of that kind of conflict or dilemma that Williams is encountering here in New Orleans. That sense in which he wants to pursue pleasure and desire, but also the moral implications of that, and what that means for his soul, I suppose. And so here we see, as we've said very euphemistically, a kind of judgment on what New Orleans has to offer hedonistically, but also what New Orleans means for him ethically or morally. And I think we see that conflict, or at least the question of that conflict, raised through the character of Blanche, don't we, in her promiscuous past and desire to present herself in a way that perhaps isn't as honest to her history as we might like. Finally then, the race and the rich combination of cultures, how's that reflected in the stage directions at the beginning? Well, we've got a very sensory description of the area, haven't we, with smells and sounds. So the faint redolence of bananas and coffee hint at maybe other countries and the import of goods from Africa. And then we've got the music of Negro entertainers. which of course hints at jazz and the infatuated fluency of brown fingers. That passion is there, isn't it? But also the expertise. So it's a city that it isn't just all about having fun, but it's about the pursuit of artistic expression and a place where artists are able to flourish, I think, is important. And finally, Williams describes it as a place where there's the warm and easy intermingling of races. So we've got Mexican women, black women, and then, of course, Stanley with his Polish ancestry, and then others who have kind of colonial ancestry, all together with not a sort of great deal of judgment. And, of course, that's one of the things that Blanche brings that is perhaps at odds with the society of New Orleans, is her statements about Stanley and his nationality, his ethnicity. And we'll look at that a little bit more when we get to people. But for now, let's have a look at property. I only want to focus on one thing, actually, one noun phrase from the way that the property is described, and that's that it's a corner building, the flat that the whole of the play is centred around. And I think that's really interesting symbolically, because a corner sort of denotes a turn of direction, doesn't it? If you're heading north and you're turning right, or you're going east. And so it's a kind of complete sort of 90-degree turn somewhere else. And the play itself is about a turn of sorts, isn't it? Or a shift, a transition from the old South into the new world. We're at this crossroads for America, where either we pander to the nostalgic yearnings of the Deep South and the antebellum America, plantation-owning southern colonizers who owned slaves, and that those ideals that we could perhaps say Blanche aspires to achieve. And we're at this point where actually New Orleans has moved into an industrialized future, a place where there's more acceptance of different races, and also a place where the working class are exalted. Stanley talks about Huey Long, every man a king. And the working class are fed this American dream that actually, if you work hard enough, if you have enough grit and determination, you can achieve anything. And so, while that we can look at that skeptically, it's what Stanley believes, isn't it? Stella even says that he's the only one of his group of friends that's going to make it. It's a head-on clash, isn't it, of class ideology. I almost imagine two people coming around a corner and bumping into each other, and that's almost what the play is like, isn't it? With Stanley and his American dream individualism, to sort of use the Marxist term, he's part of the proletariat, the working class, and he sort of has this head-on clash with Blanche, who's while she's lost all of it, still feels that she has a kind of inherited privilege of the Deep South. She's a member of the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class. And Blanche, of course, arrives in a place of sort of majoritively working class people, and expects to be treated in the way that she perhaps was when she was in Belle-Rive. But of course, corners as well hint at concealment, which is another major theme in the play. That idea of hiding and then exposing. You come from around a corner and you're in the light and you're seen. And there's a pattern, isn't there, in the play of truth being hidden and then exposed. So just to take one example, even in this early scene, even in scene 1, Blanche wants to hide the fact that she's an alcoholic, that she needs alcohol to sort of temper her nerves. And Stanley, when he first arrives, well, what does he do? He holds up the alcohol to the light to see that it's been drunk. So he's in the business of exposing what Blanche wants to conceal. And of course, that links with that antithetical struggle between reality and illusion. Blanche is constantly making an effort to present an illusory version of herself to people, to Stella. Particularly, but also to the others, and we've got this question, I guess, that Williams raises about what's better. Is it better to sort of live in ignorant bliss, or to live in fantasy world, or to sort of confront reality head on and deal with the facts? And thirdly, identity, of course, has a lot to do with concealment, because when something's concealed, we don't understand identity in its fullest sense. And in New Orleans, identity is, I've said here, brazenly on display. It's a place where you can feel free to express your identity, at least Tennessee Williams did with his homosexuality. And so that kind of jars with Blanche, doesn't it, when she first arrives, because she doesn't know how to cope with her identity sincerely. Because of all of the trauma that she suffered in the past with the death of her husband, who turned out to be homosexual, she doesn't really know how to deal with those emotions in an open and honest way. And so maybe this, and I know I'm on a huge stretch here, but the corner building, is it symbolic of kind of hiding and wanting to protect your identity from others? And of course, corners have a lot to do with entrances and exits in the play. Lots of people seem to be coming round corners when they arrive in scenes. And we get this sense maybe that nothing changes in this world of New Orleans. Things just remain the same. People come from around the corner and then they leave around the corner. And is there this idea of entrances and exits? Blanche, of course, arrives in scene 1 and she leaves in scene 11. And the baby as well is a kind of entrance, isn't it? So as the baby arrives in the world, Blanche has to leave the world. Is that kind of very obvious marker in the plot that we're all destined for death, and we're mortal, and so our end is inevitable. The same as well goes for the Old South, the Deep South, and those ideals. This baby dressed in blue is representative of a new era that Blanche isn't involved in. Thirdly, then, people. I just want to focus on Blanche and Stanley. Of course, there are other people in this, other characters in this scene, but a particular emphasis on class and privilege here. And it's important with characters. Williams, in an interview, if you read his interview with himself at the end of this version of the play, he talks about how he doesn't write about victims or villains. He's concerned with people who express villainous qualities or the qualities of being a victim. People are complex, aren't they? And so are the characters in this play. And so it's important that we don't say, well, Blanche is either privileged and judgmental, or she's vulnerable and she's a victim. She's both. And we need to understand how those two things kind of work together. The same with Stanley, as we'll see in a second. But let's have a think first about her privilege. Her attire, the way she's dressed when she arrives, of course, that famous phrase, she's incongruous to the setting. And she's dressed in a white suit with a fluffy bodice, necklace and earrings of pearl, white gloves and hat. And Williams obviously emphasises colour here, at odds with the grey and dank and dark description of New Orleans. She stands out. And that white, of course, can sort of connotations of purity and the way that she wants to express her identity at this point in the play. But also, we get a sense of luxury and advantages. So with the jewelry and the pearl and the way that she's described is typical of someone of her class, I suppose. And then also with her reactions to the place, we get a hint of her prejudice. Of course, throughout scene 1, she becomes increasingly judgmental about where Stella lives and the life that Stella's made for herself. But the stage directions describe her as then she looks down at the piece of paper, then at the building, then again at the slip, and again at the building, looking up, down. It's sort of this exaggerated, almost melodramatic way of sort of dealing with the situation. She can hardly believe it, so she's kind of looking down and up and down and how could this be the place where my sister lives? But not just in terms of class, but also in terms of race and ethnicity. She uses the ethnic slur in scene 1 repeatedly of a Polak, which, of course, later in the play, Stanley's very indignantly says that he's not a Polak. He's not even Polish. He's 100% American. But this comes at the end, this outburst comes at the end of her tirade about how Stella wasn't there to help when she lost Belle Reve. And she says, where were you? You're in bed with your Polak. And Blanche she kind of exalts herself, doesn't she, to this position above people of other nationalities, and there is this sense in which she's othering those from other places from around the world. Her first response to the idea of Stanley being Polish, well, that's a little bit like Irish, isn't it? You can't get much more ignorant than that, can you? And fourthly, to do with privilege, this is when sort of Stella gives her a rundown of the living situation. What? 2 rooms, did you say? We've got the italicized 2 there that sort of hints at her utter disdain at the idea that she's only got 2 rooms. So, of course, we get a sense of, and you could go through and trawl through and find millions of other phrases where Blanche is privileged and judgmental in this opening scene. But there's the flip side of that, isn't there, in which actually Blanche is vulnerable. We have a sense of sympathy for her, even in scene 1. She's anxious of her environment. She's sort of described as stiffly hunched, pressed close together, tightly clutching, blind look slowly around. Look at the verbs and the adverbs that describe her mannerisms here as she arrives in New Orleans. She's sort of precious and fragile, isn't she? She's scared and apprehensive about her surroundings. And we do feel a little bit sorry for her, don't we? While she might be this sort of prissy princess who damsel in distress type woman, she is also vulnerable at this stage. Arthur Miller said in his introduction to the play that Streetcar at the hour of its birth echoed the fate of the outsider in American society and raised the question of justice. Well, of course, Blanche is the outsider here. She's incongruous to her setting. And are we meant to feel sorry for her, as well as feel a little bit irritated by her behaviour? "What's that?" Blanche says, as a cat screeches near the window. It's sort of echoes of horror here. Think of Southern Gothic genre that Williams is drawing on throughout the play. Blanche, of course, describes the area as from an Edgar Allan Poe poem story, where sort of echoing the conventions of the Gothic genre. And there is a sort of a hint at horror here with animal noises. You think of sort of Macbeth, where it's said that the horses sort of ate each other. We've got this sort of animals are responding negatively to to this clash of class ideals and privileges and disadvantages sort of coming together in Stanley and Blanche. And Stanley just says sort of nonchalantly, "Cats!" Sort of goes on to shout out at Stella, who's in the bath. But again, do we feel a sense of sympathy here? Blanche is on edge. She feels scared enough that a cat screeches and Blanche is like, "Oh, what's that?" And finally, the scene ends, of course, with that first indication of Blanche's past. Stanley asks what happened with the marriage, and she says the boy died. And that dash is so significant with Blanche. If you go through the play and have a look at where Williams uses dashes to sort of emphasise the emotive weight of the moment, and this, of course, is a marker that this is something that's affected Blanche deeply, and that actually her behaviour might be a consequence of her traumatic past. Okay. Secondly, Stanley with people. Remember, thinking about class and privilege. Well, can he be cast as the worker? His attire right at the beginning is a kind of marker of his class, isn't it? His blue denim work clothes, the thing that all of the people probably would have worn at the factory. And he's characterised as the provider right from the beginning, isn't he, when he comes in bearing the meat. The stage directions describe him heaving the package of meat at her. Sort of Williams is kind of drawing on perceptions of masculinity at the time, and sort of harking back to that idea of what Huey Long said, with every man a king. Stanley at least feels that it's his responsibility to sort of bear the load when it comes to work. And he speaks in labour terms, doesn't he? So when Blanche says about where she's from, he says, "Not in my territory." And so everything is kind of in productive sort of employment language. And also we get a sense of territory has connotations of animals, doesn't it? And the idea of the male lion sort of providing for the lioness. And then at the end of the scene, where obviously Stanley's come home from a day at work and then bowling and exercising vigorously, Blanche complains about the impact of travel on tiredness. And Stanley constantly sarcastic, isn't he? And he says, "Well, take it easy," as if maybe hinting at the idea that actually he's had to. He's the one who should be tired, not Blanche, who's just travelled to the place and arrived with her suitcases. But again, on the other side, he's a worker, but he's also an intelligent lover. That's what I've called it. I guess we've got two things there: intelligence and love. And by love, I'm kind of referring to his sexual expertise, the way he's described right at the beginning as the gaudy seed bearer. He's the centre of his life has been pleasure with women, the giving and taking of it. He's a richly feathered male bird among hens, and that metaphor is quite something, isn't it? Shows us sort of not just that he's someone who is kind of proficient sexually, but goes to efforts to sort of make himself attractive and desirable. The giving and taking of it. So he's not just a worker. He's someone who is sort of has sexual expertise. Secondly, he's actually quite intelligent. So that eloquent aphorism, an aphorism is sort of saying, a truthism. He says, when Blanche talks about the alcohol, Stanley says, some people rarely touch it, but it touches them often. Which is quite profound when you think about it, his sort of understanding of alcohol's impact on a person. And actually a little bit ironic, because that's true of Blanche, that she says she rarely touches it, but actually alcohol has its hold on her. He personifies alcohol here, doesn't he? And that power that alcohol has over her as a coping mechanism for all the things that have happened to her in her life. He's also forensically curious, so he's in pursuit of the truth. What happened, he says, when she talks about the marriage. And again, he's perpetually, all the time, sarcastic when he's shouting to Stella, "Haven't fallen in, have you?" So while it can be tempting to view him as the brute, the caveman type person that Blanche casts him as, which of course he is, we've got to understand that he's actually he's an intelligent lover as well. There are the various sides to Stanley's character, the complexities with all of them. Finally, then, power. I'm going to focus mainly on conversation and how characters gain dominance in various respects. So Blanche, of course, when she arrives, is very domineering in scene 1. So there are the imperatives, the command words, and the urgency when she speaks to Stella. "You sit down now and explain this place to me." There are the opinionated exclamatives. "Why, that you had to live in these conditions?" Very euphemistic again about the place that Stella's decided to live. And then it's Blanche that determines the course of the sort of topic, the course of the conversation. So she changes direction. Look at the stage direction abruptly. "You haven't asked me about." So she moves things on, and she kind of controls what's talked about and when. And then, of course, it's not just Blanche's side; it's Stella's side and her subordination, her subjugation under Blanche. Look at the stage directions to describe her: embarrassed, a little wearily, dutifully. She's someone that's compliant and goes along with what Blanche wants. And I guess we've got to ask ourselves, what does this tell us about Blanche's character? That she's domineering, that she sort of possesses this conversational dominance. Maybe it tells us a little bit about her victimhood, that she feels the need to sort of gain that power, possess that power in a relationship. But maybe also it tells us something about those judgmental qualities, the way in which she's trying at least to enforce her culture and her ideals on a people that aren't going to be receptive. Except I guess Stella is, because she's attached to that historical narrative, I suppose, from the Old South and the Deep South. And Blanche, she comes in wanting to kind of enforce and invade. And Stanley doesn't receive it, but Stella kind of does. And does that make Blanche's fall even worse when it comes? That she feels she's gaining some ground with Stella. She's managing to persuade her a little bit about the environment that she's living in, the husband that she's chosen. But then, of course, Stanley and the other men, they don't want any of that. They're not malleable and impressionable as Stella might be. Blanche is also resentful that Stella left. So there are subtle signals all the way through until the big tirade, the big monologue, the speech. So she says, "The summer Dad died and you left us, ... And after all I've been through," there are kind of sort of trying to kind of let Stella know that she resents the fact that she left. And then there are the outright accusations. "You left, I stayed and struggled. And all the burden descended on my shoulders." Again, italicizing various words to provide emphasis. And finally, the rhetoric in that big monologue, the repetition, "I saw," I, the direct address, outright accusing Stella, the exclamatives, the metaphor, the idea of like the Grim Reaper and death being personified, and the interrogatives. Blanche is domineering, but she's resentful. She's someone that comes along with a lot of baggage, and it's interesting. We've got to think as we go through the play, how does that past and what she feels has been a kind of injustice and unfairness that's been levelled against her from Stella, how does that shape who she is through the play? The fact that she wants to voice these what she perceives as an unfairness, and then isn't kind of vindicated by the end of the play. She's, in fact, the ultimate unfairness. The rape of Stanley isn't acknowledged by the other characters. They don't believe her, or they say they can't believe her for what she says. So, in scene 1 at the start, Blanche is sort of, at least Stella is receptive to all the things that Blanche is saying. She cries. There's a kind of acknowledgement there of what's happened in the past, but Blanche doesn't get that at the end. Penultimately, Stella this is slightly controversial, I suppose, but is she emotionally secure? So is she letting Blanche dominate the conversation for a reason? So is she withholding, and is that in itself a kind of power? So she says, "Well, I thought you'd volunteer that information if you wanted to tell me." So is it not that actually Blanche is sort of stepping on Stella's toes, but Stella knows when to keep quiet and feels that actually is the most beneficial thing to do in terms of Blanche's well-being, but also for her own emotional state. She's kind of comfortable and rational, isn't she? So when Blanche starts talking about Bellerive and also about this quotation is specifically about the area that Stella's chosen to live in with Stanley, and Stella says, "Aren't you being a little intense about it?" So she's relaxed, isn't she? And she feels kind of accustomed to the way of life in New Orleans, where Blanche obviously isn't. And she responds with lots of outbursts and exclamatives about how terrible it is that Stella's ended up in this place. And also, Stella restores order, doesn't she? So, "Blanche, you sit down and let me pour the drinks." Pour spelt wrongly there. Sorry, P-O-U-R. So, is Stella a character that provides some sort of semblance of normality and order, where in the midst of the chaos that Blanche has stirred up as she's arrived in scene 1, we can't really argue with that, can we? Blanche has sort of put a spanner in the works, I guess, to use a cliche. Finally, the idea of sex. So now, Stanley or Blanche in this respect? Who's the one with the sexual power in scene 1? We get this long description about Stanley obviously being the cockerel among the hens, and after that she recognises his glance, and her response is to draw involuntarily back from his stare. So does she see his... She understands, sort of when she sees the way he looks at her, she understands what comes with that look. And kind of, I guess, gives us a hint into Blanche's past, a naive and pure and uncorrupted woman wouldn't understand how Stanley was looking at her, perhaps, but she is acquainted and familiar with the way that men look at women when they desire them. And Stanley is kind of sort of appraising her, isn't he? Sort of understanding where she sits in his scale of attractiveness. And Williams said this, so I ache with desires that never are quite satisfied. This promiscuity is appalling, really. One-night stands, the cold and beautiful bodies of the young. They spread themselves out like a banquet table. You dine voraciously, and afterwards it is like you had eaten nothing but air. And here, at least, it's going to play is, of course, going to increase in its sexual tension. But here, do we get this idea of the metaphor he uses is that you dine voraciously, hungrily, and through this stare and this initial interaction between Stanley and Blanche, do we have a little hint at the way that desire can consume and sort of control a conversation? It seems to here there's an implicit sexual tension between them. Stanley's obviously taking off his shirt and sweating and sort of been exerting himself, and Blanche doesn't really know how to respond to that, or does, and is being kind of coy. And finally, Williams himself, he called himself a rebellious Puritan, which sounds, it's kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? A Puritan is someone who rigidly sticks to religious rules. You're rebellious if you go against those rules. And this play is antithetical, isn't it? Sometimes even paradoxical in its characterizations. Blanche is the pure maiden who wants to appear uncorrupted, but in fact she's acquainted with promiscuity. She understands what it means to have sex, to be exploited, to desire, and so I guess we've got to ask ourselves, what's Williams getting at through this scene one? How is he introducing some of the questions about what it means to be human, and what it means to be a woman and a man in the 1940s in New Orleans and in America?